Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to break down a viewpoint that asks some pretty challenging questions about leadership in the Western world, and it's all based on analysis presented by Victor Davis Hanson.
Okay, let's just dive right in. The source material we're looking at today, it really all revolves around this one provocative question. Now, when the source uses a term like Islamization, what it's getting at is what it sees as this gradual giving in to radical Islamic pressures in Western culture and policy. The core argument is that there's this, shocking lack of courage from leaders to push back, and it tries to explain why that might be happening.
All right, so to really unpack this argument, here's our roadmap. First, we're going to look at the specific incidents the source uses as its evidence. Then, we'll dig into the root causes it points to, put them into a bigger theory of civilizational decline, and finally, we'll explore the kind of leadership it says is the only solution.
So the analysis really frames this whole thing as a puzzle. It asks, why aren't leaders taking what it considers to be obvious steps to protect their own cultures? The conclusion it comes to is that, look, this isn't just a simple policy debate, it's a fundamental failure of courage, right at the very top.
Now, this argument isn't built on some abstract theory. It's built on what the source sees as a pattern of real-world events. The analysis points to a series of global incidents to try and establish a consistent and frankly disturbing pattern, not just in the attacks themselves, but in how the West officially responds to them.
The first case study we're going to look at is presented as a prime example of what the analysis calls a failed leadership response. And for that, we're heading to Sydney, Australia.
So the analysis of the Bondi Beach attack really zeroes in on a couple of key ironies. First, you have the attackers who were apparently known threats, yet in one of the world's most gun-controlled societies, they still managed to get firearms legally. And second, while officials seemed to stumble, the source makes a point of noting it was a heroic immigrant who actually physically intervened to stop one of the shooters.
And this quote right here, this really gets to the absolute core of the critique. The argument is that the official response from the Australian Prime Minister, no less, immediately pivoted. It moved away from the specific ideology of the attackers and instead condemned all extremism, and then, according to the source, almost instantly and irrelevantly brought up white extremism.
Okay, the next piece of evidence shifts from a violent attack to what the source portrays as more of a cultural confrontation, right in the heart of Paris.
Here, the focus is all on the cancellation of the famous Christmas celebration on the Champs-Élysées. Now, from this perspective, this wasn't just some security precaution. It was a huge cultural capitulation. The argument is that you had a majority culture shutting down one of its core traditions, all out of fear of protests from a radical minority.
The source then brings its focus over to the United States, pointing to events from military casualties in Syria all the way to a shooting on a university campus, arguing that the pattern of response is exactly the same.
Over at Brown University, the critique shifts to the institutional reaction after a tragic shooting. The source really questions the official story, pointing to two things. First, the mysterious lack of video evidence on a modern campus, and second, the initial and incorrect blaming of a white male suspect. It's all presented as part of this pattern of hesitant and politically motivated responses.
Okay, so after laying out all those case studies, the analysis kind of shifts gears. It moves from pointing out the evidence to actually diagnosing the problem. The argument is that these aren't just random, isolated events, but are actually symptoms of deeper systemic problems or pathologies within Western societies.
And according to the analysis from Victor Davis Hanson, there are three fundamental problems at play. He calls them pathologies, that when you put them all together, create the conditions for the kind of weak leadership responses that we've just been looking at. So, what are these three core pathologies? Well, according to the analysis, first up, you have open borders, which it says allow unassimilated groups to form. Second, there's the ideology of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which the source claims creates this kind of perpetual victim class that can't be criticized. And those first two, it argues, lead directly to the third, a cultural fear of just naming threats for what they are. And this framing of that third pathology, it's absolutely key to the whole argument. The source makes this really powerful connection. Failing to name a threat isn't just a passive mistake, it's an active acceptance of it. It argues this hesitation signals fear, which then only empowers those who want to do harm. Right, so these three pathologies, they don't just exist in a vacuum, The source presents them as components of a much larger overarching theory about the current state of the West.
The source basically posits that the West is in a broad state of decline. Demographically, you've got falling birth rates. Economically, due to what it calls green energy ideology.
and militarily, with underfunded defense and major recruiting crises. But the root of it all, the argument goes, is a kind of spiritual decline, a fundamental lack of confidence in its own value. And to really make this idea hit home, the source uses this central metaphor, the idea of a nation as a home. The logic is pretty simple, right? If you value your home, you protect it. You lock the doors, you maintain it, you set clear rules. The source argues that if a country loses belief in its own values, it's like a homeowner who just doesn't care about their house anymore. They're not even going to bother locking the door.
Okay, so given this really stark diagnosis of decline, vulnerability, and failed leadership, what's the proposed solution, according to this analysis? Where does the argument lead?
Well, the antidote, as it's presented in the source material, is a complete 180 from the current trend. It calls for a form of leadership that is unapologetically, single-mindedly focused on protection of borders, of the economy, and of cultural values.
So the crucial point here is that this style of leadership is defined by its decisiveness. It's about drawing really firm lines on immigration and border security, putting the national economy first, and, this is key, being completely unafraid to call out perceived threats without any hesitation. The source points to leaders like Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and certain Polish leaders as examples of this very approach. And that brings us to the central tension of the entire argument we've just explored. It's a question that really challenges us to think about that very fine line between prudent caution and what the source would call cowardice, and the equally fine line between simply identifying a threat and engaging in prejudice. That's the core question this analysis really leaves us with.